The next one, Professor Jagdish Sheth.
Well, good afternoon. I went to United States in 1961. Like Indonesians, I'm from India, and I went as a foreign graduate student. In 1963, I became a professor. They don't know how to pronounce our names, so I was given a nickname, Jag, like in Jaguar. Ever since that association, I've been dreaming of owning a Jaguar with a license plate Jag's Jag. And the dream became a reality 14 years ago when I turned 60. I'm 74. Do I look 74? That's because in marketing, the first thing we learn and teach, it's all about packaging, right? True story, I have 2 grown-up children. They are married. They surprised me on my birthday. I come from that old age where we don't count birthdays. I went out, got my local paper, turned around and saw this beautiful Jaguar, top of the line, even the color I liked, parked in the driveway with a handwritten license plate, Jag's Jag, happy 60th birthday. It was a rental car. So I'm still looking for my Jaguar. And now that Jaguar is owned by Tata Motors, an Indian company, hopefully I'll get a Jaguar. I just wanted to talk about the rise of China and India and its impact not only just in Southeast Asia but throughout the world. So the power presentation primarily talks about the new triad power, and because of the time I will run through the slides much faster, so if you have any questions you can ask them. This is the fundamental change. While the 20th century was driven by the ideologies and the politics of advanced nations, the 21st century will be driven by markets and resources of emerging economies. This two-dimensional shift basically summarizes what is happening in front of our eyes. 4 factors are driving this one. On the upper right side is the biggest one. All advanced countries are aging and aging much faster than they realized. In Japan, every month there are fewer men than the last month, and there's nothing they can do. In Germany, net population is 0 growth, as many births as deaths, for example. US is aging. We have 10,000 senior citizens every day. So we have the baby boomers all becoming retirees now, essentially. Worldwide, this is a phenomenon. So the growth is no longer in advanced economies, it is outside the whole thing. Second factor has been economic pragmatism. More and more, the politicians have learned that what matters actually at the elections is no party ideology, nothing else but economics of the people. Are you having the jobs? Are you having the wealth? And if you can manage both, you can survive no matter what political system. Worldwide, we have seen this phenomenon pretty much. Third, and the most important factor, is the rise of the middle class. Many speakers talked about it in the morning, for example. But this phenomenon is very real in the sense that all of them are very brand conscious. And the biggest outsourcing is taking place at home, where cooking, cleaning, childcare is all outsourced into commercial opportunities, and that wave is massive, and therefore you have a consumer-based economy. It is inevitable it will grow. And the last one is that most of the countries, emerging economies, have an enormous resource advantage, not only in fact natural resources, but also human capital resources, as Indonesia has, China has, India has, for example. This is the evolution. The 1800s was basically the European century, the colonial expansion, industrial revolution, all that stuff. 1900 was the American century. 21st is the Asian century, but only half. There has to be a sense of urgency. We have to move on doing the economic growth in this region as fast as possible, because I see the next wave coming much sooner than we realized. As early as 2020, For example, the rise of Africa, and it is the largest and the richest continent in resources, and it also is building a very large consumer-based economy. Here are the numbers. This is the IMF calculations. If you look at the purchasing power parity-based GDP that was also discussed, only 2015, not too far from now, US will be 18 trillion, China will be 17 trillion, India 6 trillion, but India is underestimated by about 3 trillion because it is all cash transactions. So India is much larger actually in its size, and therefore one of the projections made in the morning that India may be the largest economy is not as unrealistic as we think. China is the second largest economy, India is the third largest, but the next slide is more important. China's growth will slow down automatically. One-child policy over the last 2 generations is coming to haunt them. China will go the same way as Japan did after World War II, or Singapore is suffering right now the same way pretty much. There is nothing they can do. In other words, as people become more affluent and more women work in the workplace, the number of birth rates will decline definition. On the other hand, India, while it will chug along for a while with lots of setbacks, after about 2020, it is likely to grow for 2 reasons. Infrastructure will become a focal point, and of course more economic reforms. United States and China is becoming somewhat negative relationship, and Chindia is actually getting together of China and India both economically as well as politically and maybe militarily is the forecast, which is very important. What are the consequences? There will be 3 major consequences, and because of the time, I will not go into the details of the slides. First one will be the pressure by the consumer demand of the rising middle class worldwide will be so large that we will have a race for resources. To produce those branded products, you need raw materials, you need manpower, whatever you need, and this will be a major, major battleground as to where the resources are, and rest of the material is in the slides will come up at the end. Second major thing is going to be, there will be huge, huge competition among the emerging markets by all multinationals. If you look at the growth of American corporations, it is primarily driven by China, for example, quite a lot from Southeast Asia, and also India at the same time, which seems to be the future, and maybe Africa down the road. And the third area is very important, that the geopolitics of the world will change, where, as you know, G8 has become G20. Indonesia is a part of that one. As you saw the ambassador talking to the average citizen in America and the answers they had. But it's very important to realize that we will see more multiple currency wars as opposed to trade wars. Currency will be used enormously to give a competitive advantage for export purposes by and large. So I'll conclude by showing the following points. While the 20th century was driven by ideologies and politics of advanced nations, the 21st century will be driven by markets and resources of emerging markets. That will be the battleground in many ways. Aging of affluent nations, economic reforms, the rise of the new middle class, and resource-based advantage are responsible for this mega shift. This will lead to a new triad power consisting of China, America, and India. The rise of Chindia will have worldwide impact on global resources, global markets, and global politics. Fostering economic growth through trade and investment between the triad power will be critical for worldwide peace and stability. And once it happens, it will get out of hand, just like the California wildfires, and hence the prevention is the only solution. There is no way one can go to war because it is almost so destructive to the world by and large. And the only way to slow down is to create an economic interdependence among these powers so that they have no urge to go to war, just like unification in the European Union, for example. Demand for worldwide resources will create a strange bedfellows among nations, such as heavy involvement of China and to some extent India into Africa, for example, and will be driven by global expansion of all enterprises. I wanted to make one point because of the time I'm running out. The largest IT services company in India will be a non-Indian company called IBM. I sit on the board of a very large company. We have 130,000 employees. but that it will be dwarfed by IBM because the human talent of India is very valuable for IBM's global strategy, for example. And major technologies breakthroughs will come from two sources. Scarcity of raw materials will be so large that we will create some sort of a cloning is my forecast. We'll learn how to clone things. We can learn how to clone chicken, fish, for example, sheep, for example. We learned how to clone natural pearls into cultural pearls, a farming of pearls, and today we can make a better job in a most mass production way than actually, in fact, what Mother Nature can do. So sustainability and cloning are very key aspects pretty much that will grow. Key drivers of innovation also will be from a demand side, affordability and accessibility of products, technologies and services. World economy will decouple from dollar. My forecast is that the dollar denomination will not be the future anymore, especially for calculating the prices of raw materials. So dollar denomination will be less and less used for trade and investment and more between currency exchanges, essentially by and large. And if you look at the currency reserves of central banks, it's a basket of currencies rather than just relying on one currency, for example. And China and India will be integrated into world politics, world social bodies, as well as world economic forums. Mergers and acquisitions will be enormous, very large scale. In fact, I think right after the elections in America, you will see announcement of mega mergers of a size we have never imagined in the 80s what happened, or in the 90s in European Union, for example, and private equity will play an enormous part around here. Finally, rise of China and India will redefine our definition of what's capitalism and what's democracy. I don't have time to talk about it, but the main point is that the capitalism will have to become more and more stakeholder-driven, not just shareholder-driven, or what is called caring capitalism. I have a book called The Forms of Endearment, best-selling, which shows you companies that care for their community, for their employees, for their customers, actually outperform financially than companies that are strictly shareholder-driven, for example. And the same thing, the democracy without discipline becomes an anarchy. So as we become more and more democracies in a highly diverse cultures and societies like India or Indonesia, one has to have some discipline around the democracy, otherwise it becomes pretty much a mutation and anarchy in the process. So I'll take the last slide if there is any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor.
Saya Andi Supriyanto. I'm from the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies at RSIS based in Singapore. First of all, I would like to ask how many questions am I entitled to ask?
Just one, please.
Okay, just one. Thank you. Jack, you have eloquently argued about the competition of our market and resources, and also you argued about the growing interdependence between these three major powers, the United States, China, and America. But I'm interested to know your take on the trend of geopolitical competition between these powers, and how will this play out in the context of the Sino-Indian strategic rivalry in the future? Thank you.
No, thank you. I think India is in that very strategic dilemma. That's very important to realize. For example, the trade between US and China, between India and China will exceed $100 billion this year, roughly. Interestingly. If you add services, then United States is a bigger partner with America, with India, but surprisingly behind the scenes, get-together of China and India is inevitable.
What is the best or ideal solution to take care of the wealth and the prosperity of workers and laborers, since that you've also implied in your conclusion that the China and India as the role model of the next wave of industry? Thank you.
Goes to the transition about the labor aspects primarily. As I mentioned to you, we are becoming a lot more understanding that the traditional way of managing command and control, as we call it, or theory X, is just not sustainable anymore. Neither for the employer viewpoint, nor even in the family too. Their father cannot simply go and say, you shall do what I tell you. Children just don't listen anymore. We changed to theory Y in 1950s by showing that if you care for your workers, then the worker becomes more productive actually, and in less absenteeism. They are putting their mind also, not just their body, behind the work and the employer, and you benefit quite a lot. A lot of experiments were done in Western Electric Plant, and that actually is the theory that is coming back again. More and more you will find that employers will have no choice but to empower their workers, especially in emerging markets. Otherwise you will see the reaction and the rewards as you see in many factories all over the world, for example. So it is in the self-interest of the business employer to be a lot more having participative management, as we call it. And fortunately, I must tell you, surprisingly, this industrial revolution we are experiencing in emerging markets, as opposed to the last industrialization that took place maybe 70, 100 years ago, especially in America, this is much more enlightened rise of the middle class and enlightenment about the worker rights, etc., than it ever was. If you look at the history of 100 years ago, it was very bad actually. We are not doing much better. There's a lot more there. And I'll tell you one more comment. I know I'm running for time. But in this age of the digital age today, we are all as managers, as employees, as politicians, fish in a digital fish bowl. Every little move that we make, even people who have no stakeholding, take a stakeholding, watch, they're curious what we do, and obviously it goes into the internet very quickly. There is no separate personal life and a professional life. It's all the same. For example, if I want to know what I did yesterday, I do a Google search on myself. They know more about me and have recorded than I know even, because I'm doing it without knowing that somebody's keeping track of everything. And you saw in the presentations how much information, the big data is coming, that is very much there out there, which means there is no way you can hide anymore.
Okay, I'll just pick up on the last point that you made about anarchy that can surround democracy, especially because of lack of discipline. I was just wondering, because I mean, especially now when with the power of media, when it's much easier to influence opinions, and especially we can end up with situations where you have, there's no majority opinion, and that could be pretty destructive. So I just actually wanted to have your opinion on what are the ideas where you think we can actually control this kind of.
One has to anticipate the emerging thoughts and the needs of the next generation of people or people in general. If you remain isolated from the real world, then you will not be able to listen what is happening at the ground level by and large. So to me, one approach is a lot more active engagement with the populations, as opposed to having the notion that as a leader I'm an elitist and you are peasants essentially, which has been the traditional history quite a lot in the political process. So there is clearly one change. The second change is that there are certain boundaries. I'm not at all comfortable with having no guidelines, at least on the internet, for example. Media is a very powerful medium. We always had guidelines when the printing press came along, for example. We had guidelines, not necessarily by regulation or self-regulation, when the television came along. Who says internet has the right to be totally free medium as it is? It is not. Any technology can be both useful to the society, but can be also equally harmful to the society. It is the way you use it, just like weapons theory, same way. So I'm a very strong believer that you must have some sort of a guidelines provided properly. So there are a bunch of ways one can create a discipline. Let me give an example. In the book I talked about the Indian democracy, which has sustained very well. But have you seen the mutations of parties? I don't need a party even today in India. I can be from a local district with one wealthy family supporting me for my political agenda by and large, and I can be self-sufficient. So the concept of party as an organization, as an institution begins to decline enormously, and there's a worry therefore. It becomes like very much what you see in small towns or small villages. A local chief or a panchayat basically governs, and there is no notion of a nation itself. Nation breaks apart essentially. So you have to counterbalance the two somehow, which is very important in my view, pretty much. That is why I'm saying that the traditional definitions of democracy, we have to think differently. Give you an example. There is one country that had 130 years of uninterrupted rule by one party. Which country comes to your mind? 130 years, one party ruled the whole country forever. And only year 2000 it changed, the party, first time. It turns out to be the state that I live in America called Georgia. Nobody questioned democracy. So we cannot say just because it's a single party rule, it's not democratic. Just because it is not a parliamentary system, it is not democracy. Democracy means listening, participating of the masses and their needs, wants, desires. If you can manage that very well, there have been great democratic monarchs who were very people sensitive. There have been great, in fact, leaders in the nations who have been autocrats otherwise, or military leaders who have been very actually caring in many ways. So we have to look at the other side, my view pretty much. So how do you balance the two becomes very critical. There is no time here to give you into specifics, but we can talk offline if necessary. Okay? Thank you.